In the dense wilderness of an alien planet called Velora, a group of scientists from Earth had built a secret research facility. The planet was known for its strange and dangerous creatures, but none were as feared as the dragons. These massive beasts could fly with grace despite their size, breathe fire hot enough to melt steel, and communicate using low-frequency growls that carried meaning even humans couldn't fully understand. For years, humanity had seen these dragons not just as threats, but as tools. Weapons they could use if only they could control them. Egan was one of the people working at the facility, though he wasn't a scientist or someone important. He was a maintenance engineer, a quiet man in his early 30s who spent most of his time fixing broken equipment and making sure everything ran smoothly. Egan didn't talk much, and no one really paid attention to him unless something needed repair. This suited him fine because he preferred staying out of the spotlight. But sometimes, when he walked past the labs or stood near the observation rooms, he overheard conversations about the experiments being conducted on the dragons. It made him uneasy, but he never said anything. He figured it wasn't his place to question what the scientists were doing. The project involved studying the dragons up close, trying to learn how they thought and behaved so they could eventually find ways to dominate them. The researchers believed that understanding their communication might give them the upper hand. They wanted to turn these majestic creatures into weapons for Earth's military forces. Every day, new tests were performed, and every day the dragons grew more restless under captivity. Some of the scientists noticed this too, but they dismissed it as unimportant. To them, the dragons were nothing more than animals. Dangerous ones, yes, but still animals. One morning, Dr. Laura Bennett, the lead scientist, gathered her team in the main conference room. She stood at the front, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "We've reached a critical point in our research," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Up until now, we've observed the dragons from a safe distance, but we need to take things further. We need to test how they react to direct interaction with humans." Murmurs filled the room as the scientists exchanged glances. Everyone knew what this meant. It would involve putting someone inside the dragon enclosure. No one volunteered, of course. Who would willingly step into a cage with 5 enormous, fire-breathing predators? That's when Laura turned her gaze toward Egan, who happened to be standing quietly near the door after finishing some repairs. "Egan," she said firmly, pointing at him. "You'll do." Egan froze. His heart skipped a beat as all eyes turned to him. "Wait. Me?" he stammered, taking a step back instinctively. "I'm not trained for this kind of thing. I'm just here to fix stuff." Laura waved off his protest with a dismissive gesture. "Exactly. You're non-combatant, which makes you perfect for this. If you were trained, your actions might influence the results. Besides, you won't actually be harmed. We'll monitor everything closely." Before Egan could argue further, 2 security guards appeared behind him and gently but firmly guided him toward the dragon enclosure. Panic bubbled inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. There was no way out of this. As they led him through the facility, he tried to focus on breathing deeply, reminding himself that losing control wouldn't help anyone. When they arrived at the enclosure, Egan felt his stomach twist into knots. The heavy steel doors loomed ahead, blocking his view of the dragons beyond. He hesitated, his feet refusing to move forward despite the guards urging him. Finally, with a deep breath, he stepped inside. The moment the doors clanged shut behind him, sealing him in, a wave of terror washed over him. He was alone now, completely cut off from the rest of the team. Slowly, Egan turned around to face the dragons. At first, he couldn't see them clearly because the enclosure was dimly lit, but then movement caught his eye. One by one, the dragons emerged from the shadows, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were huge, far bigger than he had imagined. Their scales shimmered like polished metal, reflecting what little light there was. Each dragon moved with a predatory grace, circling him cautiously, while letting out low growls that vibrated through the air. Egan's knees threatened to buckle under the weight of fear pressing down on him. His mind raced, searching for any way out of this nightmare. But as he stood there, frozen in place, something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking him immediately, the dragons paused. They seemed curious, tilting their heads slightly as if trying to figure him out. None of them lunged or breathed fire. Instead, they kept their distance, watching him intently. For a few moments, Egan simply stared back at them, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to catch his breath. Then, without thinking, he raised his hands slowly, palms open and facing outward. It was a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat, though he doubted the dragons would understand human body language. To his surprise, the largest dragon, a towering creature with black scales that gleamed like obsidian, stepped closer. Its movements were deliberate, each step echoing loudly in the silence. Egan's heart pounded harder as the dragon stopped just a few feet away from him. It lowered its massive head slightly, sniffing the air around him. The sound of its breathing was deafening, but somehow it didn't feel hostile. Tentatively, Egan mimicked the low rumble he had heard earlier from another dragon. His voice came out rough and awkward, but it carried a tone similar to theirs. The dragon paused, its golden eyes locking onto his. For a brief second, Egan thought he saw something flicker in those eyes. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. As the minutes ticked by, Egan realized that the dragons weren't going to attack him right away. They were observing him, studying him, just as much as he was studying them. And while he was still terrified, a small part of him began to relax. Maybe, just maybe, he could survive this ordeal after all. Back in the observation room, Laura watched the scene unfold on the monitors. With growing interest, her colleagues whispered among themselves, debating whether this was pure luck or evidence of something deeper. None of them could have predicted what would happen next, or how much this experiment would change everything they thought they knew about humans and dragons alike. As the hours turned into days, Egan found himself trapped in a world unlike anything he had ever known. The dragons continued to circle him, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the enclosure. At first, every movement they made sent a jolt of fear through his body, but as time passed, he began to notice patterns in their behavior. They weren't mindless beasts driven solely by instinct. There was intelligence behind their actions, a kind of awareness that went deeper than he had expected. The largest dragon, the one with shimmering black scales, remained particularly close to him. It didn't attack or even growl aggressively. Instead, it seemed curious, almost cautious. Egan decided to give it a name, Obsidian. Naming the creature felt like a small act of defiance against the scientists who had thrown him into this situation. It also helped him feel less alone. Every time Obsidian moved closer, Egan reminded himself that this wasn't just a monster. It was a living being, capable of thought and emotion. Egan spent most of his time watching the dragons, studying how they interacted with each other. He noticed that they communicated not only through growls, but also through subtle movements of their tails and wings. Sometimes they would tilt their heads or make soft clicking sounds, almost like a language. Egan tried to mimic these sounds, his voice rough and hesitant at first. To his surprise, the dragons reacted. When he clicked his tongue softly, one of them tilted its head as if listening carefully. When he growled low in his throat, another dragon responded with a similar sound. This discovery gave Egan hope. If he could learn to communicate with the dragons, maybe he could survive this ordeal. Maybe he could even earn their trust. He started practicing every day, experimenting with different tones and pitches until he found ones that seemed to resonate with them. The more he practiced, the more the dragons responded. Slowly, they began to treat him less like an intruder and more like part of their group. Back in the observation room, Dr. Laura Bennett watched the footage with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was fascinated by what she saw. Egan's ability to connect with the dragons was something she had never anticipated. His interactions were primitive, yes, but there was undeniable progress. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the implications of what was happening. If Egan could form a bond with the dragons, it meant they were far more intelligent than anyone had realized. It also meant that her team's approach might be flawed. Her colleagues debated endlessly about what to do next. Some argued that Egan's presence was contaminating the data, while others believed he might hold the key to unlocking the dragon's secrets. Laura listened to their arguments silently, her mind racing. She knew the experiment had reached a critical point. If they pushed too hard, they risked losing control of the situation entirely. But if they pulled back now, they might miss an opportunity to achieve their goals. In the end, Laura decided to let the experiment continue. She ordered the cameras to record every moment, hoping to gather as much information as possible. Meanwhile, she kept a close eye on Egan, observing how his relationship with the dragons evolved. What she saw both intrigued and unsettled her. Egan wasn't just mimicking the dragons' sounds, he was learning from them. His gestures became more fluid, his growls more confident. It was as if he was becoming something else entirely. Something neither fully human nor fully dragon. For Egan, the days blurred together. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, but he refused to give up. Each interaction with the dragons brought him closer to understanding them, and each success gave him a sense of accomplishment he had never felt before. He started noticing small details about their personalities. One dragon, smaller and quicker than the others, seemed playful, often darting around him in wide circles. Another, larger and slower, exuded a calm authority, rarely moving unless necessary. Even Obsidian, despite its intimidating size, showed signs of gentleness when it lowered its massive head to sniff Egan's outstretched hand. One day, something extraordinary happened. Egan was sitting cross-legged on the ground, resting after hours of trying to communicate with the dragons. Obsidian approached him cautiously, its massive body casting a shadow over him. For a moment, Egan froze, unsure of what to do. Then, without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand on the dragon's snout. The skin beneath his palm was warm and rough, like tree bark baked by the sun. Obsidian didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a low rumble that vibrated through Egan's entire body. Tears welled up in Egan's eyes as he realized what had just happened. This wasn't just a random gesture. It was a sign of trust. Obsidian had accepted him, not as prey or an enemy, but as something else entirely. Egan didn't know how to describe it, but he felt a connection forming between them, a bond that transcended words or species. From that moment on, Obsidian stayed closer to him than ever, almost like a guardian watching over him. Word of Egan's progress spread quickly among the scientists. Some were amazed, calling him a prodigy, while others grew suspicious, questioning whether his abilities were natural or the result of some hidden factor. Laura, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. She saw potential in what Egan was doing, but she also knew that Earth Command wouldn't be satisfied with mere observations. They wanted results, tangible proof that the dragons could be controlled. When orders came down from Earth Command to escalate the experiment, Laura hesitated. Pushing the dragons too far could provoke aggression, and she wasn't sure Egan would survive if things turned violent. But pressure mounted from above, and eventually she gave in. She authorized the use of a remote-controlled drone designed to harass the dragons, forcing them to react offensively. The goal was to observe how Egan handled the situation and whether his bond with the dragons could prevent chaos. Egan had no idea what was coming. He was sitting quietly with Obsidian when the drone appeared, buzzing loudly as it zipped around the enclosure. Its high-pitched screech filled the air, startling the dragons. At first, they seemed confused, tilting their heads and backing away. But when the drone emitted an electric pulse that struck one of the smaller dragons, everything changed. The injured dragon let out a deafening roar, and all 5 creatures turned their fiery gazes toward the source of the disturbance. Egan's heart sank as he realized what was happening. He stood up quickly, waving his arms and shouting at the drone, hoping to distract it. But it was too late. The dragons were enraged, their golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. Then, to Egan's horror, they turned those same eyes toward the observation windows where the scientists stood watching. Egan knew what was coming next, and he didn't try to stop it. The dragons launched themselves at the facility, smashing through reinforced glass and steel barriers. Flames engulfed the corridors, and the once pristine lab descended into pandemonium. Scientists scrambled to evacuate, but many were caught in the chaos. Sparks flew as equipment exploded, and screams echoed through the building. Egan watched it all unfold with a mixture of shock and relief. He had survived the dragons, but now he wondered if he could survive the aftermath. Amidst the destruction, Egan climbed onto Obsidian's back, gripping tightly as the massive creature soared out of the burning building. From above, he surveyed the wreckage below. Though he felt no pity for the scientists who had treated him as expendable, he also didn't revel in their suffering. Instead, he focused on one thing: freedom. With the facility destroyed, the dragons were now free to roam Velora once more. Egan chose to stay with them, knowing there was no place for him back on Earth, not after what he'd done. Together, they disappeared into the wilds, leaving behind only ashes and unanswered questions. The destruction of the research facility marked the beginning of a new chapter for Egan. As he soared through the skies on Obsidian's back, the wind whipping against his face, he felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in his life, he was free. Not just from the confines of the facility, but from the expectations and judgments of others. Below him, the burning ruins of the lab faded into the distance, swallowed by the dense forests of Velora. He didn't look back. There was no reason to. The world he had known was gone, replaced by something wild and untamed. Obsidian flew steadily, its massive wings cutting through the air with grace and power. The other dragons followed close behind, their shadows stretching long across the landscape as the sun dipped below the horizon. Egan clung tightly to the dragon's neck, his fingers gripping the rough scales. He had never imagined he would be riding a creature like this, let alone trusting it with his life. But trust was exactly what had grown between them. Obsidian wasn't just a beast. It was a partner, a companion who had chosen to stand by him when no one else would. As night fell, the group landed in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. The dragons settled down, their bodies creating a natural barrier around Egan. He slid off Obsidian's back, his legs trembling from the long flight. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. He needed to think, to figure out what came next. The dragons seemed content to rest, their golden eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight as they watched him move about the clearing. Egan knelt by a small stream that cut through the area, scooping water into his hands to drink. His stomach growled with hunger, but he ignored it. Food was the least of his concerns right now. What worried him more was the future. The scientists wouldn't give up easily. They would send search parties, drones, and maybe even soldiers to hunt him down. He couldn't stay in one place for too long. The dragons might have destroyed the facility, but Earth Command wouldn't stop until they reclaimed control or eliminated the threat entirely. But Egan wasn't alone anymore. He had the dragons, and that changed everything. Over the past few days, he had learned so much about them, their behaviors, their communication, their strengths. He knew how to read their body language, how to calm them when they grew agitated, and how to guide them with simple sounds and gestures. These skills gave him an advantage he hadn't expected. If the scientists came for him, he wouldn't face them alone. The dragons would fight alongside him, not because they were weapons, but because they had chosen to protect him. The thought filled Egan with both pride and unease. He didn't want to drag the dragons into a war they didn't understand. They deserved to live free, without interference from humans. Yet at the same time, he couldn't deny the bond they shared. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. The dragons had accepted him as one of their own, and he owed them the same commitment. Over the next few days, Egan focused on strengthening his connection with the dragons. He spent hours practicing their vocalizations, refining his ability to mimic their growls and clicks. Each sound brought him closer to understanding their language, and each success earned him more trust from the creatures. Obsidian remained his closest companion, often staying by his side even when the others wandered off to hunt or explore. Together, they formed a partnership unlike anything Egan had ever experienced. During this time, Egan also began teaching the dragons new ways to communicate. He used hand signals and body movements to convey ideas, experimenting with different combinations until he found ones that worked. The dragons responded eagerly, picking up on his cues faster than he had anticipated. It was as if they were eager to learn, to expand their understanding of the world around them. Egan realized that these creatures weren't just intelligent. They were curious, driven by a desire to grow and adapt. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Egan sat cross-legged in the clearing with the dragons resting nearby. He looked up at the sky, marveling at how peaceful it felt. The air was cool and the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget about the chaos he had left behind. This was his home now, a place where he belonged. The dragons stirred around him, their presence comforting and reassuring. He felt safe here, protected by beings who could easily crush him but chose instead to shield him. But safety was fleeting. Days later, Egan noticed signs of pursuit. Smoke rose in the distance, likely from fires set by search parties attempting to flush him out. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning the terrain with mechanical precision. The dragons reacted immediately, their bodies tensing as they prepared to defend themselves. Egan placed a hand on Obsidian's snout, calming the massive creature before it could lash out. He knew they couldn't engage directly yet. The drones were scouts, not attackers. Attacking them would only reveal their location. Instead, Egan guided the dragons deeper into the wilderness, using the dense foliage and rugged terrain to mask their movements. They traveled under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly and silently. Egan rode on Obsidian's back, directing the group with subtle gestures and sounds. The other dragons followed without hesitation, trusting his judgment completely. Together they slipped through the forest like shadows, leaving no trace of their passage. Despite their efforts, the pursuit continued. Search parties fanned out, across the region, combing every inch of land for any sign of Egan or the dragons. Egan knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. When that happened, he would need to act quickly. He couldn't let the scientists capture him or harm the dragons. He had promised himself that he would protect them no matter the cost. One night, as they rested in another hidden clearing, Egan made a decision. He would turn the tables on his pursuers. Instead of running, he would lead the dragons in a counterattack. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure their freedom. He spent hours planning, mapping out routes and strategies in his mind. When morning came, he gathered the dragons and explained his plan using the signals and sounds they had practiced. To his relief, they understood immediately, their golden eyes gleaming with determination. The attack began at dawn. Egan led the dragons to a narrow valley where the search parties were most active. From above, they launched a surprise assault, diving down with speed and precision. Flames erupted from their mouths, engulfing vehicles and equipment. The ground shook as the dragons landed, their massive bodies scattering soldiers and researchers alike. Chaos spread rapidly, panic overtaking logic as the humans scrambled to retreat. Throughout the battle, Egan stayed close to Obsidian, guiding the dragons with sharp commands and gestures. He directed them to target specific areas, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed while still inflicting enough damage to drive the enemy away. The dragons obeyed without question, their loyalty unwavering. Together, they turned the tide of the conflict, forcing the search parties to abandon their mission and flee. When the dust settled, Egan surveyed the aftermath. The valley was littered with wreckage, smoke rising from charred remains. The dragons stood tall, their chests heaving as they caught their breath. None of them were injured thanks to Egan's careful planning. He felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Earth Command wouldn't stop until they achieved their goals, or until Egan proved too dangerous to ignore. For now, though, there was peace. The dragons relaxed, their tension easing as the threat receded. Egan climbed onto Obsidian's back once more, ready to continue their journey. They disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only ashes and unanswered questions. The aftermath of the battle left Egan and the dragons in a strange limbo. The valley they had defended was now silent, save for the crackling of smoldering wreckage and the distant calls of birds returning to the skies. Egan stood amidst the ruins, his body tense, but his mind racing. He knew the fight wasn't truly over. The scientists and soldiers might have retreated for now, but they would regroup and come back stronger. Earth Command wouldn't abandon their mission so easily. Not when they had invested so much time, money, and ambition into controlling the dragons. Egan turned to look at Obsidian, who stood beside him like a towering guardian. The dragons' black scales shimmered faintly in the morning light, and its golden eyes reflected a calm assurance that steadied Egan's nerves. He placed a hand on Obsidian's snout, feeling the warmth of its skin beneath his palm. "We did it," he whispered, though he knew the words were more for himself than for the dragon. Despite the victory, he couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. They had bought themselves some time. But how much? The other dragons gathered around him, their massive forms creating a protective circle. Each one seemed to carry a sense of pride, their earlier aggression replaced by quiet confidence. Egan felt a surge of gratitude toward them. These creatures had trusted him, fought alongside him, and protected him without hesitation. He owed them everything, and he vowed silently to do whatever it took to keep them safe. With the immediate threat neutralized, Egan focused on moving deeper into the wilderness. Staying in one place for too long was risky. The search parties would return, better equipped and more determined than before. He climbed onto Obsidian's back, signaling to the others with a series of low growls and hand gestures. The dragons understood immediately, spreading their wings and taking to the skies. Together, they soared high above the forest, leaving the battlefield far behind. As they flew, Egan scanned the landscape below. Velora was vast and untamed, its forests stretching endlessly in every direction. Hidden within those trees were countless places where they could hide, caves, cliffs, and thickets that even drones would struggle to penetrate. But finding such locations required careful planning. Egan couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every decision he made could mean the difference between survival and capture. Hours later, they landed in a secluded canyon surrounded by towering rock walls. The entrance was narrow, almost invisible from above, making it an ideal hiding spot. Egan slid off Obsidian's back and began exploring the area, checking for any signs of danger or weakness. The dragons followed close behind, their presence both comforting and intimidating. Once he was satisfied that the location was secure, he settled down to rest. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to quiet. He replayed the events of the past few days over and over, searching for ways to improve their chances against future attacks. During this time, Egan continued strengthening his bond with the dragons. He spent hours practicing new sounds and signals, refining his ability to communicate with them. Each day brought progress, and each success deepened their trust in him. The dragons responded eagerly, learning not only to follow his commands, but also to anticipate his intentions. It was as if they were becoming extensions of his will, partners in a shared mission to protect their freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Egan sat by a small fire he had built in the canyon. The flames cast flickering shadows on the rock walls, and the air was filled with the scent of burning wood. The dragons rested nearby, their massive bodies creating a natural barrier around him. Egan stared into the fire, his thoughts drifting to the life he had left behind. He thought about the facility, the scientists, and the people who had once been his colleagues. He wondered if anyone back on Earth missed him, or if they even cared. Most likely they saw him as a traitor, someone who had turned against humanity to side with beasts. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. He had made his choice, and he didn't regret it. But there was one thing that troubled him, the possibility of being hunted forever. No matter how far they traveled or how well they hid, Earth Command would never stop pursuing them. They saw the dragons as weapons, tools to be used for domination and control. And they saw Egan as a threat, a man who had somehow unlocked the secrets of communication with these creatures. To them, he was dangerous, unpredictable, and expendable. Egan clenched his fists as anger bubbled inside him. He hated what humanity had become, a species obsessed with power and conquest, willing to exploit anything and anyone to achieve its goals. The dragons deserved better. They weren't weapons. They were living beings, intelligent and proud. Egan resolved then and there to fight for them, no matter the cost. If humanity wanted to dominate Velora and its creatures, they would have to go through him first. Days turned into weeks as Egan and the dragons moved from place to place, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. They crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and navigated dense jungles, leaving no trace of their passage. Along the way, Egan taught the dragons new strategies for evading detection and defending themselves. He showed them how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to ambush enemies without exposing themselves, and how to work together as a team. The dragons learned quickly, their instincts sharpening with each passing day. Despite their efforts, the pursuit grew relentless. Search parties scoured the planet, using advanced technology to track their movements. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning the ground with thermal sensors. Soldiers combed the forests, setting traps and laying ambushes. Egan knew they couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would be cornered. When that moment came, Egan was ready. He led the dragons to a narrow gorge surrounded by steep cliffs, a perfect location for an ambush. As the search parties entered the gorge, the dragons attacked from above, raining fire down on their enemies. Egan directed the assault with precision, guiding the dragons to target specific areas while avoiding unnecessary casualties. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but the dragons' strength and coordination gave them the upper hand. By the time the smoke cleared, the search parties had been forced to retreat once again. Afterward, Egan stood atop the cliffs, watching as the survivors fled into the distance. He felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. They had won another battle, but the war showed no signs of ending. Still, he refused to give up. He had promised to protect the dragons, and he intended to keep that promise. With Obsidian by his side and the other dragons at his back, he prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they disappeared into the wilderness, vanishing like ghosts among the trees. Behind them, the gorge remained silent, its scorched earth a testament to the clash that had taken place. Egan knew the scientists would return, angrier and more desperate than ever. But for now, there was peace. And in that peace, he found hope. A fragile but unyielding belief that they could win this fight and carve out a future where the dragons were free to live as they chose. Years passed, and the legend of Egan and the dragons spread far beyond Velora. Stories traveled from outpost to outpost, whispered among colonists, explorers, and mercenaries who dared to venture into uncharted space. Some claimed Egan had become something more than human, a man who could command fire-breathing beasts with nothing but his voice. Others said he had merged with the dragons, transforming into a creature neither fully man nor fully dragon. The truth was harder to pin down, but one thing remained clear. Egan had defied humanity's greed and earned the loyalty of the most feared predators in the galaxy. On Earth, authorities scrambled to cover up the incident. Official reports branded Egan a traitor, blaming the destruction of the facility on faulty equipment and rogue experiments. They painted him as a madman, someone who had lost his mind under the pressure of working with dangerous creatures. But their efforts to bury the truth only fueled the rumors. Among those who lived on the fringes of society, the outcasts, dreamers, and rebels, Egan became a symbol of resistance against exploitation and control. Songs were sung of the quiet engineer who stood up to Earth command, refusing to let the dragons be turned into weapons. Deep in the forests of Velora, Egan continued living alongside the dragons, far removed from the lies and propaganda. He had grown leaner and stronger over the years, his body hardened by the demands of survival in the wild. His hair was longer now, tied back loosely to keep it out of his face, and his skin bore the marks of countless battles and harsh weather. Yet, despite the physical changes, there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there before. He moved, with purpose, his every action guided by the bond he shared with the dragons. Obsidian remained his closest companion, almost like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Together they explored the vast wilderness of Velora, discovering hidden valleys, crystal-clear lakes, and towering mountains untouched by human hands. Along the way, Egan taught the dragons new ways to protect their territory. He showed them how to recognize the signs of intruders, footprints, broken branches, or the faint hum of drones, and how to respond without revealing their location. The dragons learned quickly, adapting their behavior to stay one step ahead of their enemies. Egan also worked to preserve the dragons' natural instincts. He knew they were intelligent, but he didn't want them to lose the wildness that made them who they were. He encouraged them to hunt, play, and interact with each other as they normally would. At the same time, he introduced them to new ideas. teaching them how to use tools and solve problems. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of frustration on both sides, but the progress was undeniable. Over time, the dragons began to see Egan not just as a protector, but as a teacher, someone who helped them grow in ways they never imagined. Despite their efforts, Earth Command hadn't given up. Every so often, search parties arrived on Velora, armed with advanced technology and determination, but they rarely stayed long. Egan and the dragons had become experts at evading detection, using the planet's rugged terrain to their advantage. When necessary, they launched ambushes, striking quickly and retreating before reinforcements could arrive. These encounters left the soldiers shaken, spreading fear among those tasked with capturing Egan. Tales of a man riding atop a massive black dragon spread through the ranks, growing more exaggerated with each telling. Back on Earth, the stories took on a life of their own. Artists painted murals of Egan soaring through stormy skies, surrounded by dragons breathing rivers of fire. Writers penned novels based on fragments of truth mixed with imagination, creating epic tales of heroism and defiance. In bars and taverns across the galaxy, people raised glasses to the man who had tamed the untamable, turning him into a myth larger than life itself. Some believed he was still alive, hiding somewhere in the stars. Others thought he had died fighting, taking his secrets to the grave. Either way, his legacy endured. For Egan, the passage of time brought a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He no longer thought about returning to Earth or reclaiming the life he had left behind. That world felt alien to him now, its rules and values meaningless compared to the freedom he had found on Velora. Instead, he focused on building a future where the dragons could thrive without interference. He marked their territory with subtle signs: charred trees, claw marks on rocks, and low-frequency growls carried by the wind, warning anyone who dared to approach that this land was protected. One day, while exploring a remote part of the forest, Egan stumbled upon a group of settlers attempting to establish a colony. They were unarmed and clearly desperate, seeking refuge from the chaos consuming Earth. At first, the settlers were terrified when Obsidian appeared, his massive form casting a shadow over their makeshift camp. But Egan stepped forward, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. Slowly, cautiously, he communicated with them, explaining that the dragons were not monsters but guardians of the land. To his surprise, the settlers listened. They had heard the stories of Egan and the dragons, and seeing him in person confirmed everything they had hoped was true. Under his guidance, they agreed to live in harmony with the dragons, respecting their boundaries and learning from their presence. Over time, a fragile balance emerged, a partnership between humans and dragons unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. As the years stretched on, Egan grew older, his hair streaked with gray and his movements slower than before. But his spirit remained strong, driven by the same resolve that had carried him through the darkest days of his journey. The dragons stayed by his side, their loyalty unwavering. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the fire, watching as the younger dragons played and practiced their skills. Obsidian often rested nearby, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. When Egan finally passed away, surrounded by the creatures he had come to love, the dragons mourned him in their own way. They gathered around his body, their massive forms forming a protective circle as if shielding him even in death. For days, they remained in the clearing, their low growls echoing through the forest like a lament. Then, as one, they took to the skies, flying higher and farther than they ever had before. The settlers who had come to share the land with the dragons told stories of what happened next. They said the dragons carried Egan's memory with them, spreading his message of freedom and coexistence to every corner of Velora. They claimed that on certain nights when the moon was full and the air was still, you could hear his voice carried by the wind, a soft growl blending seamlessly with the dragon's calls. And so Egan's legend lived on, not just as a tale of rebellion or survival, but as a reminder of what could be achieved when two worlds came together in mutual respect and understanding. The man who had once been an ordinary maintenance engineer became something greater, a symbol of hope, a guardian of the wild, and a bridge between species. His story inspired others to look beyond fear and greed, to see the beauty in the unknown, and to fight for a future where freedom was not a privilege, but a right.